still see people, but yeah, the restriction in social is so huge.
All right, it looks all right. Okay, I am checking my page as I always do, and we are live. All right, yes. Welcome, everyone. This is the final Facebook Live event for 2020, but we will be back next year, which is like a few minutes away. I'm here for the best new true crime stories, small towns, and I am joined by my contributor, Charlotte Platt, who's coming to us from Scotland.
Hello, from very
Hi.
dark and wet Thursday.
Dark and wet Scotland, yes, indeed, but beautiful.
Mhm.
Oh, so how are you managing? How are you holding up with our new life?
I mean, we've been very lucky where we are because it's the Highland. I mean, the Highland, everything from Inverness up is the Highlands, which is, the bulk of the country. But we've been quite lucky. The vast majority of people have been very sensible. And most of the time, we've been able to have, the socially distancing or the masks or both, and we've had people being appropriately cautious, and certainly in the Caithness area, if there has been a smattering of cases, it's been able to be tracked very quickly. So you've not had it spurring up in the same way it has like Inverness when the schools went back in the UK. Obviously a huge amount of cases started popping up because you've just got that many people mixing.
Yeah,
It was always going to happen. Whereas Inverness has had quite a lot of cases. We've not been too bad. We've managed to keep things pretty stable, which is good. But the travel ban was the worst thing. I don't know if anything similar has been done in the US, but for the lockdown, there was a ban on traveling more than 5 kilometers from home. So you couldn't travel outside the town really, unless it was for something like a medical appointment or essential work. If you were an NHS worker, that sort of thing. And that had a big impact on people, but that's been lifted, and Scotland's got a very interesting system. I don't know if you've heard about it at all. We're on a tier system. So if you're in tier one, obviously it is still around, but it is mostly normal. Do your distancing, wear your mask, wash your hands, that kind of thing. Tier two, things are slightly more restricted. Certain businesses are restricted. Tier three, there is a problem, more significant restrictions. And different areas in Scotland are being given different levels. So it means, for example, the Highlands that I'm in, we're on level one, and the Orkney Islands and Shetland Islands and the Skye, etc., they're also on level one. So you could travel between them if you needed to. You would just have to make sure it was noted where you'd been in case you were exposed during the time, and you had to be able to say who you'd been around. So that's actually made things like industry and business much simpler. It also means for things like if you're trying to look after family members or that kind of thing, it's a lot simpler as well for folk. There's not as much, people can still see grandparents and that kind of thing. So that's been a very big thing. There was a lot of upset about not being able to see old members of family and that kind of thing. So we're doing, I would say we're doing really well. And we're probably doing as well as one can expect
yeah.
in the north of Scotland when it rains all the time and it's cold and it's dark and there's a pandemic. So yeah, comparatively, we're not so bad.
No, it sounds pretty good. I think probably a lot of people would say, "Oh, I'll take that," even with the rain and even with the 3 p.m.
Mm,
darkness.
yeah.
But
It'll
you
come
get
in. The horrifying is it'll be light again soon. Like I'm
I
complaining
know.
about the fact it's dark. We're gonna start getting light again. It's just like, oh, where did 2020 go? And why did it simultaneously last 10 years and only a week?
And then it's like 11:30 at night and it's still light outside.
Yes, that's amazing. Like I grew up on the Orkney Islands, and one of the things they always tell tourists is, "Oh, you can play golf at midnight in certain areas." And you hear that and you think, "Uh huh, yeah." And they tell folk in Ireland there's leprechauns, but no, you legitimately can. Like when the summer hits, it is. This is why, like, if you've got a new baby, they tell you to buy blackout blinds
Oh,
because the poor kid won't sleep. We have too much
yeah.
fun.
Yeah, I know. I watch a lot of crime shows from Scandinavia, and then when you can tell they're
Mm,
filmed in the summer because then they'll have like a scene where people are sleeping and they've got like blackout drapes because
mm,
it's just like you go mad, and
mm.
I think people probably do.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. We don't believe in halfway areas. We believe in going the full hog.
Full Monty. Oh dear. Well, you actually, the story that you've written for the book is set up in that area. The story is called "Bullets and Balaclavas: The Long Cold Orkney Shooting." Um, Now, just give us a little overview of people who aren't familiar with Orkney, since it's not exactly the usual place you think of in Scotland, which is usually Edinburgh or Glasgow, right?
Yeah. Orkney, I mean, Orkney's fantastic. I can't praise Orkney enough. It is only just off the coast of Scotland. It's the northeast, and it's 6 miles as the crow flies from the tip of the mainland to the Orkneys. But you would not think that. It's such a fascinating place. It's been inhabited continuously for 8,500 years. It's one of Europe's biggest and most developed archaeological sites because there's Neolithic Orkney. There's history there that is just you're just steeped in it constantly. But it's also a very busy and thriving set of islands. There's a very busy port. There's a huge renewable energy sector in Orkney. There's lots of starting up and testing of new renewable areas. I mean, it's a set of islands. We're surrounded by both wind and sea. It's a brilliant place to test things. But it's such a surprise. I think people go to it and you hear about the history and you hear about the whiskey because we have a lot of whiskey and a lot of gin and a lot of alcohol in general, and many pubs to sample it. But it's just got so much variety. And we've got the Flotter oil terminal. We've got the scientific labs that are connected to that. The tourist industry is massive. On a normal tourism year, you can have over 100 liners visiting the coast. And it's size-wise, it's a reasonably sized bunch of islands. It's 70 islands in total, 20 of which actually have people on them, most of which have seals or sheep, varying. And population about 22,000, of which the two major towns, Kirkwall and Stromness, do make up the bulk. Kirkwall's got about 11,000, Stromness has probably got about 7,000, and everyone else is scattered around.
Well, the story actually is takes place in Kirkwall, which when we were initially discussing your proposal, I had mentioned that I know Kirkwall is technically a city because it has a cathedral, but obviously with this population, it would qualify as a small town, and 11,000 people would even be considered as that is pretty small, even especially if you were in the States. 11,000 would be, they'd say tumbleweeds are blowing through this main street. But yeah, so we want to qualify that for anybody who's going to say Kirkwall's a city, not a small town. Why is it in this book? Well, it qualifies as a small town. It's got a cathedral, and so it's technically a city. I mean, Beverly in Yorkshire, East Yorkshire, East Riding is like what 10 people live there, but there's a cathedral.
Well, someone's got to be there to ring the bell occasionally.
Yeah. So what is it that before we get into the case itself, but what actually inspired you to write about this particular case?
Oh, I would say there was two main parts, but part of it was because the future part of the case, because the case is in two parts really. There's the actual death, and then there's the later on happenings. And I was in Orkney and growing up in Orkney when the later on happenings were occurring. It was the talk of the town. People were asking about what had gone on. People were discussing the trial, and it was very polarizing. There were very strong views in relation to what happened, and a feeling of persecution and a feeling of it being a grudge matter and that sort of thing. So that was very interesting to have actually been around it and have heard both sides. And I wasn't in Orkney when the murders happened, so I only learned about it with the future side of things. And that really got me interested in seeing what actually happened at the time. And the second one was because Orkney just doesn't have that many murders. They don't happen that frequently because it's a group of islands. And if something does happen, generally you know what's gone on. Again, because it's a group of islands, you find out. I'm going to assume that you can. And while we're figuring out where Mitzi's gone, I will tell you some more about Orkney. So I grew up on Orkney. My family's originally from Lancashire, but we moved up in the year 2000, very, very end of year 2000. And foolishly, we decided we were going to travel from Lancashire up to Orkney, which is a drive of about 600 miles in the middle of, well, actually at the end of December. We left Lancashire on the 20th and we arrived in Orkney on the 23rd. That was a lot of driving for my poor parents and tiny me. And we had to get the ferry because the main ways into Orkney, well, the only ways into Orkney are boat or plane. The planes are not terrible. I've been on them many times, Orkney to Aberdeen, Orkney to Inverness, that sort of thing. But if you've got a lot of luggage or small children or animals or you're moving house, you're stuck with it being a ferry. And the interesting thing about taking one of these ferries is that bit of water that I mentioned between the Scottish mainland and the Orkney Islands is the meeting of the North Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. Now you can imagine what happens when two incredibly large bodies of water meet. And then you put yourself on a boat going through that. I'm not someone built for the sea. I'm a land mammal. Those ferries are terrible. And yet we got on one in December the 23rd, in terrible weather, and to Orkney we went. So that was a choice. And one of the interesting things about being on the Orkneys in the middle of December is there's very little daylight. So you get your sunrise around 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning, and your sun sets around 3 p.m. And it's not a slow set. It is a 10 minutes. Oh, it's looking like it's getting a little bit dark. Oh no, turn the lights on. The sun's gone to bed. And this is, again, a very beautiful thing if you know that's going to happen. If you're 10 years old, you don't know that's going to happen. It was a culture shock. As Mitzi and I were discussing, one of the other things that was a little bit of a culture shock was the size. Coming from Lancashire, reasonably large areas, places like Manchester, Bolton, etc., lots of people come onto the Orkney Islands, Kirkwall. You can walk through the town in about 20 minutes, maybe half an hour, depending on if you want to stop and look at things. It is quite different, but it is fascinatingly beautiful. And as Mitzi was mentioning, technically a city because of St. Magnus Cathedral. Now, if you go to see anything in Orkney, the things that I would recommend are the St. Magnus Cathedral and the Italian Chapel. The St. Magnus Cathedral, you can't miss it. Like, it's big. It's beautiful. It's a sandstone cathedral. It took hundreds of years to build, and the islanders did it. You know, generations of people worked on building it as a monument, and it is just fantastic. It's surrounded by a churchyard, or a kirkyard, depending on where you are. And it has got some of the most fantastic stained glass and wonderful history that's just painted onto the walls. You know, there's historical gravestones, there's notes and commentaries on important families. There is a massive amount of the history of the islands shown and carved into the stone that you're walking around. And it's a non-denominational cathedral, so it allows people of any faith to use it. But it's a massive focal point for the town. And it's a huge social focal point as well. You know, the cathedral green is the main sort of town green. So in terms of things like the Christmas tree that goes up for the town, or things like the Memorial Day parade or that sort of thing, that's where it'll be happening. It's in very much the heart of the city, even though the city is technically a town. The other thing I mentioned just then was the Italian chapel. Anyone who knows Orkney will be aware that Orkney has a huge history in relation to the Second World War and the scuttling of the German fleet in Scapa Flow and the building of the Churchill Barriers. The Churchill Barriers are a fascinating thing. Google that. Just look at how insane those are. They're fantastic. You know, one of the things that was somewhat, I would say, not acknowledged for quite a while, or was sort of brushed under the carpet, was that there was prisoners of war, a huge number of prisoners of war in the local community. And one of the things that they did was make the Italian chapel. And the Italian chapel is what it sounds like. It was a chapel made by Italian prisoners of war. But if you look at it from the outside, it almost looks like it's an air hangar or that sort of thing. It's a dome shape, which was made out of food cans originally. It was made out of the cans for the provisions that they were given. And inside has got some of the most fantastic art it was made for them to have their own place to pray because we don't have a huge number of Catholics in Scotland. Well, controversial area, but we got rid of a lot of them in the history. Again, look it up. And they wanted to have their own place to be able to worship, and they were allowed to build it. And it's a huge tourist spot. It's one of the things that you would be put on a tour of if you're doing a tour of the history side of Orkney. But it's just fascinating to know that something so beautiful and something that obviously was such a cherished and wonderful thing came from prisoners of war and came from the horrors that was Second World War, and is still something that people come to see today and something that people take a lot of succor and solace from today. Although speaking of tours of Orkney, if you were going to put on one of those, my dad was a bus driver. He used to do these. You're going to get the full set of information from me now. While we wait for Mitzi to come back. So the other things that you'll be able to see, the Churchill barriers. Now, Churchill barriers are what you do when you decide you don't want the submarines coming around your patch anymore. You sink hundreds of thousands of large, and by large I mean the size of a man's torso and bigger, blocks of cement across the islands to build a road on top of them so the submarines can't go through. We have never claimed to be a subtle people. These took years to make, but are still in place, and in fact are one of the main roads through the islands because they take you from the main Orkney mainland through to, all the way down to South Ronaldsay in the South Parish, which has two of the larger ports on the island. Huge deal for trade. The St. Margaret's Hope is one of the two large ferry services from the islands. There's a huge amount of trade to and from Orkney. A lot of people move up here on that one as well because it's a catamaran that's got more room. But yes, Churchill Barriers are very impressive. The other historical things one might see is Scale House. Now that's a big house. That sounds like I'm underselling it, but Scale House was actually a huge property for the area, and it's got a great history with the area. You can do a full tour. You can discuss things like people that were found dead under the floor, whose bones were put back, which is slightly concerning. The build-up and history of industry in the area and that sort of thing. And while you're there, you are very close to the Ring of Brodgar. Now, the Ring of Brodgar is a large stone circle. We had a lot of those in the UK. We liked them a lot. What makes this one quite special is it's part of two. The Ring of Brodgar was the Ring of the Moon, and a few fields over on the other side there's the Ring of the Sun, which is in a significantly worse state of repair than the Ring of Brodgar. The Ring of Brodgar is roughly, I would say, I'm only going to have UK things to compare to, you guys, so this might not mean too much to you. It is roughly the size of a school playing field, and the stones, they are thought to be probably slightly post-Neolithic, but not all that much. They are a huge tourism element. They're not as big as, say, your Stonehenge or that sort of thing, but they are established. They are very beautiful, and standing on them, you can see the loch nearby. You can see right across the islands. I don't think from memory you can actually see over to the coast. I think from where it is on land, you are just looking at the loch. But I haven't been there since I was younger, so don't quote me on that. This is taking you closer to Stromness, so the further we go from here, we're heading more out towards Stromness side of things. And yeah, it's a fantastic place to see people. It's a fantastic tourist spot. And it's one of the places where you can really see a wonderful example of the history of Orkney still being up and alive, and the example of the way that what you are seeing is the same thing that the people before you would have seen as well. And one of the most wonderful examples of that is Skara Brae. And Skara Brae is, again, it's one of the most famous sites on Orkney, if not the most famous site on Orkney, I would say. And it is a almost complete Neolithic village. And the interesting thing about Skara Brae is for a very long time, it wasn't there, by which we mean it was actually uncovered by a storm. There was a significant, earth-shakingly significant storm. I think in the very late 1800s or early 1900s, and it caused such a significant shift in the land that it actually uncovered this village that had been they've been posted over and turfed over. Oh, I see a notification. Mitzi's back.
Hi, I don't know. I guess, have you been talking this whole time?
I just started telling people about historical sites in Orkney because I didn't know if they could still, I didn't know if we were still live or not. And then Michael kindly commented. So I was like, oh, okay, you're just going to get a tour of Orkney until Mitzi's back.
Yeah, it looks like we had an outage for a brief amount of time. I'm hoping this thing actually kept going.
It seems like it. Someone commented, so I'm assuming yes, in which case, again, I'm so sorry. You guys have just gotten an in-depth talk about archaeological Orkney.
I'm sorry, I don't know. It's like the weather's fine, the sun is out, but there's no wind, but hey, whatever. I was like going crazy. I thought it was you because like I'm talking away and then I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry. And I feel like a complete, prat over here going on and on. And
Thank you for saying that you were listening. I hope you feel more informed about Orkney now.
God knows they turned in here some juicy murders and they got a tour of Orkney. So I whatever it was you said, I appreciated that you kept it going. I was like rebooting the thing and calling the internet company ready to commit a murder. I'll get on my own true crime story. God knows it's tempting. Oh, well, okay. So, now I guess now that I'm back, I have to do my job. And hopefully we'll stay on. Now, actually, in your particular story, you get into a lot about the actual legalities of the case, and you actually have a background in this, right?
I do. Yes, there was a big reason for that. My day job is that I'm a solicitor. So mostly I buy and sell houses or do future planning for people, like writing wills and that kind of thing. And yes, so it was very interesting. I've actually attended a couple of talks by Donald Finlay, who gets a mention. He's a very, very well-known QC. And it was very interesting reading about the court side of it and looking up like the actual court case notes from when this was done and that sort of thing.
So, well, I know who to call then if I end up moving to Scotland. So if I get a property or if I'm gonna, I'll die at some point. So
I'll happily buy a house for you or write a will, although I do more of the house buying.
Well, I need to shift a few more books so that because you guys have a really strange purchasing thing there. It's bidding in a closed thing, and you can't
closing dates. Yes.
Yeah, that's weird. That's a whole different episode. So now this particular case from your story, this took place when?
So the original murder was back in the 90s. It was quite a while ago, and then in the actual dealing with it and it coming to the courts wasn't until 2007, 2008. So that's why it's the long cold shooting. There was this massive gap between the actual murder and the poor death of Shamul, and then Mr. Rosses, plural, that ended up being involved, actually getting into court.
Yeah, I know that was pretty extraordinary. So this particular case, I'm assuming since when I was off air, you didn't actually talk about it, right? So can you? Okay, great. So can you give us an idea? So what is the actual crime here that happened?
Okay, so the shooting was the murder happened in June, and the actual circumstances are, if you imagine just your typical UK Indian takeaway restaurant. It's still a restaurant today. It's a very good one, and there were families there having meals. There was service going on. That particular place does takeout as well, and a man dressed all in black with a balaclava covering his entire face walks in, comes up to the gentleman, shoots him in the face, specifically in the eye, and walks out again. And this was incredibly shocking in Orkney. Things like that. You'd maybe get a drunken brawl in the street. You'd maybe get people having a row, but something as cold-blooded as just walking in, shooting, and leaving was an absolute bomb blast for the community, and it was incredibly shocking for the families that were in as well. Shamul, as the gentleman was known, was serving a family, including children, when the person walked in, and it was just shot in the face. And the whole restaurant went into shock in relation to it. The killer, when he'd walked out, ran down the alleyway, and there's two alleyways, one on each side of this property. It's slightly unusual that way, and just seemed to vanish.
Yeah, I mean, it is horrible. It's like if this was a someone who was a politician, for instance, this would be an assassination almost.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the actual, tell us a bit about the gentleman who was murdered. So, I mean, this actual crime, overall, the rationale for this crime. I mean, they looked into if he was a Bangladeshi national, right?
Yes, and he'd come into the UK in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, visiting a friend, and really enjoyed it and decided to move over. And again, that wasn't irregular in the UK at the time. There's always been a high immigrant population coming in, coming out, that sort of thing. That's not an irregularity. And he'd visited a friend in Orkney and just fallen in love with it. Moved up in 1993, I believe it was, didn't stay, left again, but then moved up again to become the manager of the restaurant. And again, that's not an unusual thing for the area. You know, you'll see people who are maybe coming to scope it out or coming up for a little while to live there and see if they actually do like it, and then maybe moving away just to compare, and then coming back because actually they decide that they do enjoy it. And I mean, you have to acknowledge, and this does become an important point later, Orkney is mostly white. It is very, very white. And I say that as an alabaster person, as you can see, comparing me to the wall behind me. You know, there is not a huge amount of people of color in the community, and particularly in the 90s, you probably could have counted on one hand the number of non-white families in the area. I certainly know, growing up in Orkney in the time frame that, you know, the 2000s to the 2010s, again, there still wasn't a huge number of people of color, but it was starting to get a little bit bigger. And race was one of the things that people thought could be involved. But equally, there were thoughts about, was it something to do with, he'd been based in London originally when he moved to the UK, and it was very well known in the 90s that there was gang violence involved and that sort of thing. Or could it have been a family falling out? He was from quite a large family, and there were 12 siblings in total, and that sort of thing. But at first, it was just a complete mystery. You know, he'd not had a falling out with anybody. There wasn't any secret feuds. He was seeing a woman in Orkney, but there wasn't any thought about that had caused any massive upset. She wasn't in multiple relationships or anything like that. It seemed like a complete blank slate of a situation.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, there. You know, when something like that happens, you figured there had to be some sort of a motivation behind it, and there was a motivation behind it, but a very unexpected one and a very tragic one, actually.
Uh-oh, we're frozen. Oh no.
Oh no.
Oh,
Oh,
you're back.
okay. Oh dear, are we there? This is getting really nerve-wracking. Okay, I feel like I should like accelerate here. So the actual motivation behind this crime, they eventually found out, was a racist crime. It was just this guy's skin color, and someone decided to kill him because of that.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the things that was the most frustrating about this thing entirely. I mean, in the 2000s trial and the later trial, one of the things that came out was that the person who had done the shooting was only 15 at the time, but was found to have Nazi leaning views and to be trying to recruit others to also have those views. You know, he was talking about, and I'm going to use the language that was used at the time, but he was talking about things like kill all the blacks and that sort of thing, which is obviously, even in the 90s, and there was a lot of racism in the UK, there still is a lot of racism in the UK, but it was much more open then. Even then, that was significantly inflammatory. You know, it was startling to hear someone saying that, and especially to hear someone who's only 15 saying things like that. You know, it should have been a red flag at the time, and to a certain point it was, but there was the additional complication of the young man standing in the area. And one of the things that I discussed quite a bit in the article, and one of the things that was a very large community issue at the time, was this 15-year-old was the son of a policeman, and he was also the son of the president of the gun club and the firearms disposal officer, all of which you are the same person because it's an island and you have many roles.
Yeah, yeah. I mean that was something, because it's as if I mean, from my take on this story, it almost seemed as if, because we've got his father, Eddie is the father, who's the policeman of the perpetrator of the crime, the 15-year-old. It seems as if there was all this stuff going on with Eddie in the court and whatever, and then they said, well, he was, what was it? He was obstructing justice or whatever, yeah. And then it's just and then the murder suddenly just seems as if it got forgotten.
Yes, and the big crux of that was part of the reason that Eddie was charged was that there was, it all hung on these bullets. The bullet used was part of a set of bullets that was very, very specific. And we know it was specific because they were actually rejected for not being fit for use. And there's only a limited amount of those. It's a known supply. And only certain people had access to those on the island. And in fact, it was because it was a batch that was nicked. You know, they were stolen. They should have been destroyed. And then they sort of spread through the community as different gun users got access to them. But it was a very, very narrow field. And the fact that the firearms officer and the person responsible for disposing of firearms for the larger community lied about the bullets and would have known how to get rid of evidence because it was his job to do that was a big, big part of this, because the main reason why the procurator fiscal, who's the person that decides if cases are going to be laid or if charges are going to be sought in the Scottish system, didn't pursue Michael, who was the 15-year-old, was there was no actual connecting physical evidence. And the feeling very much was, well, there won't be any because his dad will have cut it up and chucked it in the sea.
Yeah. I mean, that really frustrated me because, I mean, obviously at some time later, I mean, it was eventually discovered that this 15-year-old boy, the son of the police officer, was the perpetrator of the crime, and a racially motivated crime. But what frustrates me, and I'm sure frustrates a lot of people, is the fact that he was just let alone to go on with his life and live his life. Meanwhile, you know, Mr. Mahmoud's killer is not brought to justice. And this went on for some years, correct? I mean, the young man, Michael Ross, who is the perpetrator, he joined, what was it, the Black Watch Regiment?
So he excelled. I mean, you know, he went off and joined the army. He became a very well recognized member of the Black Watch, and the Black Watch is a very renowned Scottish area of the military, and it's a high regard to get into there. And you know, he'd been in Afghanistan, he'd been in Iraq. He was very well praised for being a leader, very well praised for administering first aid under fire. You know, there was all these things to indicate that he'd put himself into a position where he could do very, very good things, and was successful in doing them. But it was one of the things that actually resulted in some very strange things that happened towards the end of the matter, which I'm sure we'll discuss. And it was this strange void where, you know, it's a very polarizing issue in the islands. You know, there's a large amount of the community who feel, yes, absolutely, they got the right guy, and equally there's a large chunk of the community who feel actually this was a stitch up because people didn't like his dad and they've tried to make a narrative fit. And there was that gap where all that animosity and all that uncertainty brewed for years. And then there was the breakthrough of someone coming forward and intending to leave an anonymous tip. And the problem of trying to do that in an island community is people know your face. So the gentleman went in to leave a note, was spotted by someone who said, I knew him, and the anonymity of that note vanished.
Yeah. I mean, it's as if it seems as if in many ways there were so many things that they just did not want to find Eddie culpable for this crime, as if somehow it was I mean, from what you outline in the story, it was as if this guy had a neon sign and an arrow pointing to him, killer, killer, killer. You know, I mean, how much, you know, how obvious can it be? And then obviously later on when he's finally caught, it was horrendously obvious. as far as so his father actually his father was charged with some crimes, but then he wasn't. Was he imprisoned for anything?
He was. He was imprisoned. Part of what made it a slightly worse situation for his father was obstructing justice is a bad one. They don't
Yeah,
like you doing that. There is a
yeah.
prison sentence attached to it. But it was extra bad because he was a police officer. And if you hold what's termed a position of trust, so if you're someone like a solicitor or a police officer or a court worker or that sort of thing, the punishment in relation to that is actually worse because you are seen to be abusing the position that you're in. And he was sentenced to 4 years in prison. He served 2, and then he was let out on release, so he could be brought back in if he did anything illegal, which is normal in the UK system. We tend to do that quite frequently for most of our prison sentences, although there are certain exceptions. But he continued to maintain his innocence despite there being some pretty big things like him saying that he didn't have the bullets and having the bullets, and the person that gave him the bullets confirming that they gave him the bullets, and that sort of thing. So there was a controversy around Eddie's side of things, but there was a very clear set of circumstances that went on, and you could track these incredibly rare bullets down to him. And to be devil's advocate for a moment, in his defense, he was the disposal officer in relation to firearms and the associated things. So, of all the people on the island to have access to very irregular bullets, he's one of the few people you expect to do so. But it is the lying about it that was the problem. He said that he didn't have them. He did not acknowledge it until the lead investigators were talking about them, and he had been called down to the scene of the murder to identify the casing that from the bullet that was used, acknowledged that it was a 9mm casing, did not mention that he had bullets like that or that he knew of where other bullets like that would be. And that was what's really skewed against him, because if he'd seen that, if he'd known about it right from the very occurrence of the murder and being called to identify that, he should have been declaring it, and he very deliberately didn't and continued not to until he had no other option.
So, do you think then he was aware that his son was the perpetrator, the killer?
I don't know if he was aware of that at that point, but he must have had the knowledge that he had bullets like that at home.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was his job to. And even if it wasn't his job to, as a gun owner, he has to. That's one of the requirements. Guns are significantly restricted in the UK for a variety of reasons, and you have to know what you've got. And equally, it was his job. He had to know what he was handling. And I don't have my own children, so I'm not going to pretend I know what it's like dealing with teenagers. But for the stuff that Michael had in his room, for things like a decommissioned machine gun and that sort of thing, he knew what his son was interested in. And he'd taken him shooting. He knew that his son was capable of doing things like this. I don't think anyone wakes up and thinks, "Oh, my kid might be a killer" or that sort of thing. But he would have had that knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems that Michael's interests were rather unsavory. I mean, as a parent, I mean, I'm not a parent either, but I think I would kind of think something's not kosher here.
Yeah,
My kid's really into some weird crap.
Yeah, and even allowing for the teenage boys to go through an edgy phase, that's happened forever. But even allowing for that, some of the stuff that was reportedly being said and some of the things like the Nazi propaganda and that sort of stuff, that should be giving you a pause. That's not just a big interest in World War II. That's very specifically going down a certain alleyway.
Yeah.
And particularly, even if you take away all the concern about whatever abhorrent racist views might be there, if you are in a small community and you hold a high profile role, like a police officer or a social worker or a solicitor or whatever, you have to be on good behavior, and your family members have to be on good behavior because you are seen as representing the office that you hold. And there's no way he would not have had conversations like that with his kids.
Yeah, yeah. So well, when Michael was actually in jail, then not Michael, I'm sorry, Eddie, his father. Michael was just he was just living his life and continuing along.
Yeah.
And then how many years later was it that finally they got some actual evidence that they could tie to Michael and bring it
So
into court?
it was 2006 when the anonymously intended but not successfully anonymous note was handed in, and that caused the investigation to be reopened. Now, Michael had been a very strong suspect back in the 90s. There had obviously been, given the circumstantial evidence, and circumstantial evidence is still evidence, even solicitors know
Yeah.
that. But there had obviously been circumstantial evidence, but no ability to actually tie him to the place or to the weapon. They never found the weapon, and there was no one who could identify him as having been the person that did the shooting. And then a gentleman handed in a note to the Kirkwall police office saying he had been in nearby public toilets on the night of the shooting, and when he had come out of the toilet to go and wash his hands, he'd bumped into Michael Ross, dressed in black with a balaclava on, rolled up so we could see his face, but that Michael had very quickly turned around and gone back in. And the gentleman hadn't known that the shooting had occurred because it happened while he was in the loo, and had only realised later on what that meant. Now, he had sat on that for over a decade. Like, that's a long time.
Yeah.
But said eventually that the guilt got too much, and that's why he went to hand in the anonymous note. And that, again, was a large area of controversy because there was a lot of debate around the trial about how legitimate was that? Was this person really sat festering with a guilty conscience for 12 years, or was it a case of him being put up to something, or was it a case of a conspiracy against the Ross family and that sort of thing?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it does seem a little strange that he waited 12 years. Was there ever any explanation as to why?
In first, there was mention of fear of reprisal. So that
Okay.
if he'd gone and said to the local police, hey, it was one of your own kids that's
Yeah.
done this, that he would have been told, no, it wasn't. You don't know what you're talking about. Watch your back, sort of thing. And in a small community, it's not unreasonable to say that. I wouldn't say Orkney is a particularly terrible place for that sort of thing, but I can understand why someone would hold a concern like that in certain areas. And then he put it out of his mind, and then the guilt got too much, and he felt he had to come and say his piece. And that was challenged quite robustly in the court case. You can read a lot of the Scotland court cases online, and you can see that being hammered quite significantly. There was a lot of suspicion around that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, when Michael actually got to court for the trial, what would you say was the real pivotal moment, the real thing that hinged the case that pointed at him as the culprit?
I think the biggest thing for people was there was no other reason for this man to be killed. There was nothing in his background. There was nothing. There was no scorned lover. There was no husband of someone he was having an affair with. There was none of the usual things one would look to find. It seemed random. And the only thing that caused a spark in relation to it was there had been allegations of Michael shouting racist abuse at the restaurant. And generally, being racist, he was known to hold racist views. There was people came and gave evidence in relation to that, and that, on top of his desire to try and incite, and on top of his desire to try and bring people round, was one of the main things that actually made the connection. And the feeling of, yes, he'd gone and done all these good things. Yes, he'd served in the army. Yes, he'd been, by all accounts, a very good soldier. But there had been this maliciousness and this very intense and seemingly from nowhere racism that was felt to be the inciting point. And I think that was really what brought it round for people. And I mean, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of challenges. How could a 15-year-old boy walk in, kill someone, walk out, not seem to break a sweat, seem to be incredibly calm, and that sort of thing. And that's certainly something that was put very firmly to the test in the court matter, and very firmly debated in the community. There was a big feeling of, was anyone really comfortable with the idea that a 15-year-old could do that? which I can understand why that's a debate in the community. You know, it's not, you don't want to think that the kid you see walking home from school could pop up and knife you in the back. That's just not something anyone wants. But yeah, it was a very controversial area.
Yeah, well, I can't help thinking in a way that if he hadn't have been 15, that they might have gone after him a bit more robustly at the beginning. I mean,
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, we tend to see this in a lot of cultures, that when it's somebody who is a minor, the word child is often misused in conjunction with, criminals. So yeah, and I think in my opinion, I think that maybe if he'd have been older, they would have pushed a bit harder on this. But
I
what's
think if
done
he'd
is
been
done.
17 rather than 15, it would have been handled very differently.
Yeah. I mean, as a lawyer yourself, I mean, surely you must also have frustration and having written this story and seeing that really justice took a long time to be served, and it maybe almost wouldn't have been served. It's quite possible.
I think the worst thing about a case like this for me is there was definitely, as I say, it's polarizing in the community, but there was definitely a view of there was an attempt to cover up. We saw that there was an attempt at the cover up. Someone went to prison to do with the attempt at a cover up, and then it was just left to languish. And I think particularly there was a feeling of, if Shamul had been Sam, or if there had been a different ethnic background, would it have been treated in the same way? Would it have been handled in the same way? And the UK does have a very bad history with that. You can look at a wide variety of cases where people of color just were not treated in the same way and were not treated fairly, especially in murder situations. And I can understand why people feel like this was an instance of the same sort of thing. Looking at the discussion in the court cases and looking at the discussion, I mean, they named 15-year-old Michael as a person of interest in the case. They said he was who they thought did it, but they couldn't prove it.
Yeah.
And that, in the Scottish system, that is as close as you can get before you charge somebody. You know, it's very similar in relation to there's some quite famous double jeopardy situations in the Scottish system that hinge on this lack of physical evidence. This, we really think circumstantially you've done it, but we don't have the actual evidence to prove it. And this was one of those until there was the intervention from the Member of Public.
Yeah. Well, when he's finally found guilty, the story doesn't end there, does it? I mean, you would say, "Oh, great, yes, he's guilty. Lock him away, let him rot." This murdering, beast. But it didn't quite turn out that way, did it? Tell us
This
what
is
happened.
my favorite bit.
I mean, this
I
is
can't
beyond
tell
belief,
you.
really. Yeah.
It's so funny. Like, I've been in this courtroom, so I know the setup for this, which is what actually makes it funny. So the setup in the Scottish system is the dock. In the dock, you do have security nearby, but they're not stood right beside you like they maybe are in the American system, as some people might be used to. And so they pronounced that he had been found guilty. They confirmed what was going to happen, and then the gentleman launched himself out of the dock and made a run for it. And he made quite a successful run for it because he got out of the courtroom and he got along the corridor. And it wasn't until one of the older gentlemen who helped run the court tackled him, he almost got out of the court. And what was fascinating was, just the audacity of this. This was, people don't do that, but he did. He gave it a fair shot and he nearly managed it. But also, they later found, not all that far away from the court, quite a jog, but not all that far away, a car stocked to the brim with weaponry. Now, again, in the UK, we have quite strict laws in relation to those because of circumstances. But oh no, he had a lot of guns, he had grenades, he had survival gear. He said his plan was to drive off to the Highlands and just live in the forest. Now, don't get me wrong, you can do that. It's not recommended, it's not going to be a good winter, but you could manage it. And oh boy, he had planned to. And then it doesn't end there either, because they got him into prison and he keeps trying to escape. He just keeps having a go anytime he can.
Well, and also with reference to the courtroom, this was a courtroom that they used to try terrorist cases in, right? So security was pretty hardcore.
Security was good, but he gave it a shot. And it is like, if you've been in the Scottish courts, like the whole point of the way that the courts are set up in Scotland is justice must be seen to be done. Outside of very certain circumstances, if you want, you can go and sit and watch a trial. The press can watch a trial, and individuals can go and watch a trial. So it is set up in a way to keep people separate from the actual proceedings that are going on, but there is a very large public presence. And he went through that, just zing, off he went. And I really do think the man would have properly gone on the run. I think there would have been a full-on manhunt going on for him if he'd managed to get out of the door. And the guy that stopped him was like an older gent in his 60s, like who rugby tackled him. And Michael Ross was a Marine. He was a very well set, guy. This isn't some scrawny little junkie. He was able to do harm. And nope, this guy just went for him.
Well, I mean, to say you're going off to live in the forest and get away, I don't think you need a bunch of grenades for that. So that's
what are you gonna do? Bomb the salmon? Like, nah, I don't believe that.
Yeah. Maybe some fishing poles, some winter gear, but the whole thing is total nonsense. And yet, and to bring it a bit more nonsense is the fact that after all of this, there are still people who are saying he's not guilty, and he's even got a rather high-profile individual who's fighting in his corner, right?
Yes. Oh, there's a huge thing in relation to this. So there is actually I would say it's almost I don't want to say that it's grassroots, but it almost is. There's quite a huge pushback in relation to it, and it's locally. You can still see things like bumper stickers. You can still see things like looking in place to try and get funding to look for evidence that what's been done is incorrect. You have a very famous solicitor and advocate, Amr Anwar. He was involved in it. He's been quite famously involved in a lot of miscarriage of justice cases. And don't get me wrong, one of the gentlemen I went to university with actually worked with Amr. He's a very, very interesting gentleman. He's very, very passionate. But it is one of those cases where I can understand why there is a desire to look into it, especially with this big gap, and especially with the allegations of a conspiracy against the family. But looking at the bare facts of it, it's very difficult to say it was a miscarriage of justice, and it's very difficult to say, even if, again, playing devil's advocate, even if you want to say that the good the man has put into the world is a net positive, and that him going into the army and being in the conflict zones and administering that first aid, etc., is all good into the world, he still murdered somebody. You can't just cross that out with the good actions that he did later on.
No, exactly. It's almost like, when they keep rounding up some of the old Nazis and other that have, run off, and they're like, somebody's nice grandpa. And it's like, well, yeah, but grandpa was up to some really bad stuff, and that doesn't excuse what was done, Yeah, whatever good you supposedly have done since that. But, well, it's quite a case. I mean, and God knows, maybe we're still going to hear more of it if it gets,
He'll try and escape again. He absolutely will try and escape again. I don't doubt that. And I mean, again, on the one hand, certain places don't consider it a crime to try and escape from prison because they think it's the normal human thing to do. And you can take a view on that whichever way you want to. I fully expect he will try and get out again.
Yeah, well, you could write a part 2. Part 3,
the
part
salmon.
Oh dear. So just to reiterate, the story is Bullets and Balaclavas, the long, cold Orkney shooting. Before we leave, and hopefully I won't get cut off before I ask you, but are you working on anything you'd like to tell us about? Any projects you'd like to share?
I'm working on a few things at the moment. I'm actually currently doing a master's in creative writing, and part of my dissertation for that is I'm doing a hybrid collection of short stories with an overarching narrative that ties together at the end. That's a fun experiment. And my first novel, A Stranger's Guide, came out this year. COVID Club. That was fun. But yeah, that's available through Silver Shamrock Publishing. You can get it on Amazon, or you can contact me and I'll send you a signed copy. And I have short stories in various anthologies. I recently had one come out in The Inferno, which is a British-led anthology examining modern retellings of Dante's Inferno and the different layers. That was really fun to research for. And I am working on a couple of novels, but The Masters is kind of taking a lot of my attention on that.
I bet it is. I bet. Well, I'm so glad you were able to join us. And I appreciate you keeping things rolling while I was like wondering when my internet was going to come back on. You know, it actually went off. It went off the other day again too. So it's like, ah. And then I called them, and then there was a recording saying, we'll be doing maintenance in your area starting tomorrow. I'm like, well, hello, that's tomorrow, not now.
Yeah.
Well, thanks. I've been speaking with Charlotte Platt, and she's a contributor in the best new true crime stories, Small Towns. Thanks so much for joining us from Scotland.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been fabulous to speak to you and to tell people the wonders of Orkney.
Thank you so much. Bye.